All right, we are going to turn again to 1 Samuel chapter 17. First Samuel chapter 17. We looked at the first half of this chapter last week. First part of chapter 17, of course, introduces us to the giant named Goliath and his defiance both of the God of Israel and of the nation of Israel. He in one place mentions that he had reproached them. He had humiliated them. Goliath has been coming out day and night for 40 days. And spewing his challenge. And when Israel would not step up to that, he would humiliate them. And Israel is becoming a laughing stock. It's one thing, to be afraid of this giant. It's another thing to be the children of Israel who claim the name of Jehovah, the Almighty God. And then cower, and no one stand on his behalf, and no one be willing to stand up for his honor when his name has been ridiculed and when his name has been mocked. No one would stand up to him. You learn later in the story that David comes along, and David really came along because his father sent him with some goods and some gifts and wanted to see how the battle was going. Of course, when David gets there, ain't no battle. No one is fighting, and every time it looks like Israel's ready to take the plunge, and every time Israel's ready to go and fight and actually get this battle started, here trots out Goliath into the forefront and issues his challenge. And his challenge was, what? One of you, just one of you, come and fight me. One of you come and stand against me. If you defeat me, we'll be your servants. If I defeat you, you be my servants. And everyone was intimidated, of course, by that sight. But David finally comes and hears this, and he's insulted because God's insulted. David's not just insulted because people are afraid. He's insulted because this giant has spoken against Israel, and he's spoken against the name of their God. And David looks at the people and he asks, why hasn't anyone stood here? You all have been promised great wealth. You've been promised the daughter of Saul as king. You've been promised freedom from these levies and taxes, and yet the person that defeats this giant will be honoring God, will be restoring the honor and integrity of the name of God. It says there in verse number 26, what shall be done to the man that killeth this Philistine and taketh away the reproach from Israel? You guys have a chance, somebody has a chance to stop this humiliation in front of all of the nations right now. Israel is a laughingstock and a humiliation to all those that would hear of this. David's motives were challenged. His own brother thought less of him and thought low of him. And that's where David gave his classic line that we mentioned last week at the end. What now have I done? Is there not a cause? And then David begins to turn, and he'll talk in verse number 30 to anyone that will listen. Why hasn't someone stood up to fight for the honor of God? Why are you letting this uncircumcised Philistine spew this defamation and this hatred against us and our God? And that's where we pick up with verse number 31. Goliath has been trotting out every day for 40 days. No one will stand up. No one will accept this challenge. No one will go out to fight for him. And David's pretty well fed up. And how many times has David heard it? One time. David comes, and the first time he hears it, that's enough for him. It's enough for him to think that God is being insulted and that Israel is being humiliated. Number one, let's talk about David's preparation, because that is just as important as the actual battle itself. Verse number 31, it says, "And when the words were heard which David spake, they rehearsed them before Saul, and he sent for him." Now David apparently has shown more courage than anyone else in Israel. At least he's, speaking up about it. Everyone else is kind of cowering and falling away. But David, at least from verse number 29, he says, "Is there not a cause?" Verse number 30, he turns and he speaks after the same manner. And David begins to find whoever he can talk to. Well, word begins to spread of what David is saying. And so it was certainly worth reporting to Saul. And they tell Saul what's going on. And so Saul sends for David. "Saul, there's a guy out here that's actually sounds like he might be willing to challenge." And Saul says, "Well, okay, well, go get him. Bring him here." Verse 32, "And David said to Saul, Let no man's heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go and fight with this Philistine." Don't be discouraged. David, when he's brought into Saul's presence, tells him not to worry. I'll go out and fight. And those are indeed bold words. They're not prideful words. Now note the difference in that, okay? There are things that can be done boldly, but not necessarily pridefully. You and I both know from what we read last week where David's heart is, what his motives are. This is not something that he is taking upon himself so that he gains a reward of money or Saul's daughter. Or the things that David cares about are the things the Lord cares about. And he cares about God's honor and the defiance of Israel. "Thy servant will go and fight with this Philistine." David volunteers to go and fight him himself. David does something that no one else was willing to do. Listen, no one in the army, none of David's own older brothers, not even the king of Israel himself. It's true to say David has more courage than anyone right now. David has more courage than his brothers, more courage than the king, and more courage than every man that's standing in the army of Israel right now. I like that he volunteers there. It's one thing, back in the previous passage, to say, you know what, somebody should do something. Somebody should stand up to this giant. It's another thing to say, I'll do it. It's another thing to volunteer. It's another thing to say yourself that you are willing, right? It's always easy to point out somebody should do something, and yet David doesn't just point that out. When it comes down to it, if need be, I'll do it. I'll go fight him. Now, this is what Saul has needed for 40 days, right? Saul has been looking for someone for 40 days that would stand and that would take this challenge, that would have the courage to go against Goliath. Well, now that Saul has someone who's willing to accept that challenge, it's not the guy Saul's looking for. Look at verse number 33. "And Saul said to David, Thou art not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him. Thou art but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth." The good news is there is somebody willing to fight against Goliath. The bad news is it's not somebody in the army. It's a guy that just came from the shepherd's field. It's this young man named David. And Saul looked at David and immediately assumed, yeah, this ain't gonna work. He looked at him, and he's smaller, he's younger, and he's inexperienced. And Saul basically pops off with it, this guy's been a soldier longer than you've been alive. He just totally discounts, by looking at David, totally discounts any hope or ability that he would have to fight him. So, again, size, youth, inexperience, all things pointed to Saul that this would be a losing effort. And again, we are reminded that Saul can only always see things from the outside. Saul, like many of the rest of the children of Israel, struggles to see things from the spiritual side. The spiritual side doesn't ever come into account here. Nobody ever considers that. He only looks at what he can see. He only looks at David in his youth or his size or his inexperience. He hasn't been in the army. And Saul looks at him and figures, there's no way this could work. He's been a warrior for years, and you're so young. Verse 34. And David said unto Saul, Thy servant kept his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock. And I went out after him, and smote him, and delivered it out of his mouth. And when he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, and smote him, and slew him. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear. And this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God. Now David has been told that he's too young and he's too inexperienced, and yet David feels confident that his preparation for this battle started a long time ago. David's preparation and his readiness for this battle did not start 10 minutes ago or 2 days ago whenever he got on the scene of the battle. He let Saul know that he's been preparing for this and that God's been preparing him for this a long time. He's fought with a lion. You ever fight with a lion? Anybody ever seen anybody fight with a lion? You ever seen anybody fight with a bear? And yet David, as a shepherd, multiple times has put himself in the way of danger, has put himself in harm's way to protect the sheep. If you've been following along, that's another one that you'll want to mark down. When David talks about the Lord being his shepherd, David knows what it's like to be a shepherd. David knows what it's like to put himself in danger's way, put himself in harm's way to protect the sheep. And he tells Saul, I know you think I don't have it. I know you think that I'm too young or inexperienced, but let me tell you where I have been. I've fought a lion and I've fought a bear. I've watched my father's sheep, and I've watched as a lion came and tried to take one of the fold, and I've watched as a bear came and tried to take one of those, and he has fought with them and more than once put himself in harm's way. And yet, each time, what does it say there? Verse number 35, I caught him by the beard and smote him. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear. You know how long God's been preparing David for this? All his life. David has been in a place where God could prepare him and get him ready for this day, for what was coming now. And that's often how God does prepare us. There is a call and a challenge to serve and to do faithfully wherever we are, especially right here and right now, right? The challenge for us is to be faithful and to do what God has for us to do in the here and now. There is no perfect 100% fail-safe way to know for sure what God might be preparing for us, what God might have in store for us in the days that come. What would have happened if in these earlier times David sees a bear or David sees a lion and he does what you and I are going to do? Run. Get out of harm's way. Run as far away as you can, as quickly as you can. If he does that, then guess what? David's not ready. David is not ready for this battle. David's not ready to go and fight this giant. But because he had fought a bear, because he had fought a lion, that gave him a courage that he might not have had now, but he does. Now I want to give us a challenge. And I know these are things sometimes that we worry about or that we think about. But here's a challenge. Don't worry about whether or not you're going to have courage when the great trials of life come down the road. I know we think about those things, right? What's going to happen when things get really bad? Or what's going to happen when I face some great trial or great temptation? Am I going to have the courage to overcome that? Let me challenge you with it. Don't worry about that. Don't worry about those things right now. What we should worry about is to start living courageously faithful now. Because that's not really how courage works. If we have to start efforting ourselves today, because if we're not, if we're not faithfully working now, I would be silly to think that someday courage is going to turn on like a magical switch. Like one day when things get really hard and there's a great falling away and everyone else is struggling, on that day, I'm going to find the courage to stand up. When nobody else will, I'm going to find the courage to stand. That's not really how that works. Now, one thing we are assured of in God's Word, of course, is that God gives a grace that is needed for the moment when it arises. Right? There's no sense in asking the Lord for tomorrow's grace when tomorrow's not here yet. Sufficient unto the day are the evils thereof, and the grace that comes with it. Tomorrow will have its own troubles and graces to deal with those things. But we are going to prove ourselves courageous and faithful now, today, in the small things. And that is going to bolster our courage. And that is going to bolster our faithfulness for the days that do come. If we wait until the greatest trial of our life to start being faithful, how do you even know what that is? Because I'm pretty sure that in the moment that you're staring down a lion, you probably think it doesn't get much worse than this. It doesn't get much harder than this. This is about as difficult as life can get. And then one day you find yourself on a battlefield and staring down the field from someone who's 9.5 feet tall, who's so large that his spearhead weighs 15 pounds. He has to have somebody carry his shield out in front of him, and your entire army is cowering away. David was prepared and could have courage in this moment because he has been courageously faithful before. And he could explain that to Saul. I know you don't think I'm ready. I know you don't think I'm prepared. You look at me as someone who's young, small, and inexperienced. But I tell you what, I've stood up before, and I've fought a bear, and I've fought a lion, and I'll fight this Philistine. And he says here in verse number 37, moreover, the Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion, out of the paw of the bear, he will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said unto David, go, and the Lord be with thee. I do like the progression of David's boldness too. His first statements merely were, somebody ought to fight. And then it was, I'll fight him. And now it's, and I'll kill him. And I'll end this. Not only did David have a tested courage, but he also had a tested confidence. As a shepherd fighting lions and bears, it's unlikely that David knew what he was being prepared for. It's unlikely that he knew he was being prepared to fight against a giant. And it's likely that in our current efforts, we may not know what God is preparing us for. But his confidence was that God had delivered me then. God will deliver me now. Don't go slack on the things that God has done for you before. Don't just put those in the past. Don't bury those. Don't forget about those things. What God has done for us in the past is a help and a testimony that God helps us and that God will help us. And David took that. David took those victories that he had against the lion and against the bear, and he basically tells him, listen, if God delivered me then, God will deliver me now. God's not going to deliver me from a lion and from a bear just to let me die at the hands of this uncircumcised Philistine. And the way that he had seen God work on his behalf before gave him confidence that God would continue to work on his behalf. If God delivered him then, God would deliver him now. And these things, a tested confidence and a tested courage, are the best preparation that David could have had. Now, we're going to read here in just a second that Saul tries to prepare David, But the way that Saul tries to prepare David is completely fleshly. It's completely physical. There's no spiritual intent behind it. It's all, it's all armor. It's all things. It's all weaponry. And David has a courage and a confidence that God had wrought in him by challenging him before. So remember that. Now let's go to verse number 38. And Saul armed David with his armor, and he put an helmet of brass upon his head, and he armed him with a coat of mail. And David girded his sword upon his armor, and he essayed to go, for he had not proved it. And David said unto Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not proved them. Now, still seeing things only outwardly, Saul assumes, all right, but if this guy's going to have any success, I have to give him the best armor possible. Now, who do you suppose the best armor possible belonged to in Israel? Probably to the king. I'm not saying that that's self-serving, but if I were king, I'd give myself the best armor too. David's going to need every bit of help that he can get. So he loads him up. He takes, according to verse number 38, a helmet of brass upon his head, a coat of mail, right, the chain mail to protect him from strikes that he might receive with a spear or with a sword. What's the problem with that? What is the problem with verse number 38? There's already one thing you know about Saul. Saul's a pretty big guy, isn't he? Now, I don't want you to look at the story silly. You are not to read from the passage, like when we speak of David being a youth, we're not to assume that David was Elliot, right? You're not reading or assuming that it's a 9 or 10-year-old boy going out to fight the giant. Was he a youth? Yes. Yes, he was a young man. But he's one who had actually, been trusted and entrusted with his father's sheep and had fought off a lion and a bear. He is at least, he is a young man. But he ain't Saul, right? It's, even Josiah is bigger than Elliot, but Josiah, if he puts this coat on of mine, it's not going to look right. It's not even going to look right. It's going to swallow him up. Now, this coat will definitely keep him warm this winter, but you know what it's not going to be? It's not going to do for him? It's going to be pretty painful to move around in. It's going to be painful, not helpful to move the arms around. It's not going to be helpful for David to wear this armor. I can just picture this helmet for the guy that is head and shoulders taller than everyone else in the kingdom. He puts the helmet on and he puts the mail on to protect himself, and it just doesn't look right. Not only does it not look right, it doesn't feel right. And it doesn't feel right to David. Notice what he said in verse 39. David girded his sword upon his armor, and he essayed to go. So you get the impression that David has the armor, it is put on him, and he's going to give it a go. And he gets about 2 steps and realizes this isn't going to work. I haven't proved these. I haven't tested these. The minute that he tries to go, it doesn't work. And he says in verse number 39, he had not proved it, and David said unto Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not proved them. And David put them off him. Now, David realizes that this may be the best armor in all the nation of Israel. But if he gets out on a battlefield and he can't move, what good is it going to do him? Right? He hasn't proved them. He hasn't tested them out, right? It's like, I'm trying to think of a comparative analogy, right? That like, we all like baseball, right? You know when a baseball player gets a new glove, he doesn't get a new glove off the shelf from the store and run out and play baseball with it, does he? You know what he does? He puts the oil in it, and maybe he wraps it, he gets some rubber band, puts a ball in the glove, takes some rubber bands, puts around it, and he puts his hand in it dozens of times, and he squeezes and he squeezes, and he puts it in the oven, and then he squeezes and he squeezes, and he works that thing. Why? Because when he gets it out to the field to play, he wants it to be like his hand. He wants it to be second nature. He wants to have tested it and proved it. And that's the way that David wanted to be as he went out into this battle. He doesn't want to have this armor on that he's never even tried on before. He's going to get out there. He can't move. He can't swing his sword. He can't do anything. No, I can't do this. I haven't proved these. I haven't tested these. And it says that he took them off. That's a challenge for us, right? Because the Bible tells us that we have spiritual armor. The Bible tells us and encourages us to engage in spiritual warfare. And it tells us that we have armor, right? In Ephesians chapter 6, we have the sword of the Spirit. We have the helmet of salvation. We have the breastplate of righteousness, shoes of the gospel. We have the shield of faith. You ever test those? You ever try those out? You want to make sure that those work. I'm telling you, when the day comes that you need them, you're going to want to make sure that those have been proven and tried and tested and work. Engage. So we engage in warfare. We engage in spiritual battles, and we put those things to the test. And David says, I haven't proved these, and I'm not messing with this. But he knows what a stone feels like in his hand. And he says in verse 40 that he took his staff in his hand, chose him 5 smooth stones out of the brook, and he put them in a shepherd's bag which he had, even a scrip, and his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. David knew what worked. David knew what he had tested, and David knew how to find some good stones, and he knew how to work a sling, right? And we've sung that song. You guys know what a sling is, right? Big old, probably made of some kind of maybe leather, at least the pouch would have been, and he would grab it on both ends, and it would sloop down, and there'd be the little pocket there where the stone would sit. And they'd swing that thing around, and they knew how to hold it so that when he got to the right angle, he'd let one end of the strap go, and it would go flying out along with the stone. Now, depending on the length of the strap, depending upon the size of the stone, I don't promote this a whole bunch, but maybe you guys should watch, look up a YouTube video sometime of people that are actually practicing one of those old school slings. I'm not talking like a slingshot, like the guy that pulls back something and slings it. I'm talking about these guys that actually work a sling with stones. Watch how accurate they can be. Watch how fast they can fling those things. It's actually pretty amazing to watch. It's really interesting to watch those sometimes. David knows how to do that. David it doesn't even feel right. It doesn't even look right. And David hasn't tested this big old helmet and this coat of mail. He goes down to the brook and he gets some stones and he has a sling. And that's what he's going to use. That's what's been tested. That's what's been proven. And he draws near. And when you get to the end of verse 40, David has let you know a couple of things. He's not trusting anything like Saul was. He's not trusting armor. He's not trusting helmets. He's not trusting anything fleshly. He is relying on the God that has protected him in the past. He has courage because he has faced challenges like this before and come out successful. And he has a faith and a trust in God that if God has given him victory before, he will give him victory again. That's how David goes to battle. Okay? It took us a little while to get there. But you get to the end of verse number 40, and David has a courage and a confidence that's unmatched, and he's not trusting in anything but the Lord. All right. Number 2, let's look at this battle, David and Goliath. It says in verse 41 that the Philistine came on and drew near unto David, and the man that bare the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about, he saw David. He disdained him, for he was but a youth and ruddy and of a fair countenance. Oh, David comes out to fight against Goliath. And Goliath, when he gets out to the field and he finally gets close enough to see and tell who it is, he's insulted now. He is wondering, really? This is who you've sent out to fight against me? The pretty boy? The young guy, the kid that's young and ruddy and of fair countenance? And he's insulted. It says there in verse number 34 or verse number 42 that he looked about and he disdained him. Man, he just looked with disgust. What in the world? He says in verse 43, the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that thou comest to me with staves?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. He was insulted. This is really what you've sent out to fight against me? You think that this is worthy of me to fight against me? And he begins to spew insults and profanities, and he cursed him in the name of his gods. Now, if you're familiar with the context of some of the last times that the Philistine gods have been spoken of, you actually go back to chapter 5, and we saw a Philistine god named Dagon. You guys remember that story? We didn't read it as part of ours, so read that sometime. But just a little Goliath ends up just like Dagon, falling flat on his face. He says in verse number 44, after he's cursed David, that the Philistine said to him, "Come to me, and I will give thy flesh unto the fowls of the air and to the beasts of the field." David, you're going to die, and the animals are going to be able to pick apart what's left. And David said to the Philistine, "Thou comest to me with a sword and with a spear and with a shield, but I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied." You can almost imagine the looks that he got from people as he speaks. You almost get the picture of Goliath, this 9-foot-tall giant, probably with this booming and thundering voice as he laughs and he spews his hatred and his disdain for David. And David, as a young man, probably has to scream, probably has to get really loud, to make his voice heard, that you've come to me with swords and spears, but I'm coming to you in the name of our God. You have defied the armies of Israel. He says in verse 46, "This day will the Lord deliver thee into my hand, and I will smite thee and take thine head from thee. And I will give the carcasses of the host of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air and to the beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel." I tell you what, David trusts God, doesn't he? He believes, and he's bold. His confidence is bold when he stands up and he says with a loud voice, "No, I'm going to give your bodies to the beasts of the field and to the fowls of the air." And he basically screams with a loud voice, "And I'm going to cut your head off. And today, these nations will know that there is a God in Israel." For the last 40 days, Israel has not given any one of the nations any reason to believe that they have a God they believe in, that they have a God they trust in, that they have a God that they have confidence in, have they? Not a single person has led anybody to believe that there's a God in Israel. Till David steps in and says, "No, today you all will learn that there is a God in Israel when I cut your head off." David's intense. He says in verse number 47, "And all this assembly shall know." It's not just enough for the nations to know. David needs Israel to hear this too. Right? This sounds really good when David's, talking smack to Goliath. But here's what Israel needs to learn. That the Lord saveth not with sword and spear. That starts from the king all the way down, doesn't it? You know what Saul thought was going to win this battle? Not David. Not somebody who's young and inexperienced. And if David goes, he better take the best of the equipment that he can possibly find. David says no. And even our assembly is going to learn that's not how God wins these battles. That is not how God delivers his people with swords and spears. The battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. And it came to pass, when the Philistine arose and came and drew nigh to meet David, that David hasted and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. Eventually, after the war of words had started to end, Goliath gets up and he starts to make his way toward David. And you know what? David starts running. And David, though, he does not run the other way. He is not scared to face against this giant. And he starts running toward him. When everyone else had run away, we got the picture last week of they were set in array. They were ready to start a battle. And Goliath came out and everyone backed down. But David runs to meet him head on, one-on-one. And it says in verse 49 that David put his hand in his bag, and he took thence a stone and slang it, and smote the Philistine in his forehead, and the stone sunk into his forehead, and he fell upon his face to the earth. What a shot, right? When I didn't write down because it's been attributed to some different people, but this quote's pretty popular. When Israel was saying, he's too big, how can we win? David was saying, he's too big, how can I miss? And David went with a confidence that he was going to kill that giant. And he went running, and he grabbed a sling, and he slung it, and he slung it hard. Okay, and this, again, it's not some little slingshot where he shoots a marble, 20 feet. This guy takes a sling and whips that thing around, and was such a full force. And God directed that stone right into the forehead of this giant, and it was slung so hard and so fast that it sank in. It didn't just hit his head and bounce off. It sunk, and it killed him. And it killed him. If it says there in verse number 49 that it sunk into his forehead and he fell upon his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and smote the Philistine and slew him. And there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood upon the Philistine, and took his sword and drew it out of the sheath thereof, and slew him, and cut off his head therewith. And when the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they fled. When was this battle won? When did David defeat Goliath? There's different thoughts about that. Was it in verse number 49 when he slung the stone and hit him in the forehead? Was this battle already over when David showed his trust in God? When David said, God will deliver this Philistine into my hand. Some might think that the battle was over then. God had already won this thing for him. Was this battle won in the preparation when David fought a bear and a lion in his father's sheepfold and gained a confidence and a trust and faith in God? When was this battle won? This battle was won because David believed and trusted God, and God gave him a great victory. And David did what he said he was going to do. And David didn't have a sword, so he ran and he jumped on top of the giant, and he grabbed his sword and he cut his head off, just like he said he was going to do. Now, it's interesting that it says that the Philistines saw their champion was dead, that they fled. I thought that they were going to agree to be their servants. Wasn't that what they promised? You defeat me, we'll be your servants. Doesn't seem like that's the way that worked out, is it? But God wrought a great victory that continued. It says in verse 52 that the men of Israel and of Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines until thou come to the valley and to the gates of Ekron. And the wounded of the Philistines fell down by the way to Sha'arim, even unto Gath and unto Ekron. And the children of Israel returned from chasing after the Philistines, and they spoiled their tents. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it into Jerusalem, and he put his armor in his tent. What a great victory that God gave the children of Israel and gave David over Goliath and the Philistines. This is one of our favorite stories, right? This is a story that we're taught from the time that we're so young. If you're in church, you hear about this. This is not the first time that even Caroline, the youngest one here, has heard about David and Goliath, right? But in going through this and going verse by verse, I just want us to be reassured and told again, this is more than a battle between armies. This is more than just the one-on-one battle between David and Goliath. This is a story of a young man who had confidence in God, a young man who God had prepared for years prior to this, a young man who was faithful and diligent in his place and in what God had for him at that time. And in his faithfulness then, God was preparing him for what was coming next. And that was to fight a giant. Now, there are people that look at this story, and sometimes these stories can be taken so far. I'm not the kind that believes that the story of David and Goliath is about, you slaying the giant of name it, right? I'm not one that tries to take every story to my own self-serving extents. But what this story does teach us is of the faith and confidence of a young man who was ridiculed by his own family and ridiculed by his own king, and yet never lost his faith in God. And the boy who was ridiculed was the only one who was willing to actually try, was the only one that was actually willing to go and fight against this giant. And it was more than a battle against this giant to David. This was about restoring the honor of God. What did David say? When this is over, all the earth will know that there is a God in Israel. David was not content to let this world or these nations think that there's no one in Israel that has confidence in God. How can there be a God in Israel? They claim this, but then no one will, they'll just stand there and let their God be insulted. They'll just stand there and let their God and their armies be defied. And David said, no, no. And David would not stand for that. He would not sit by and let his God and his armies be defied and reproached. He also said that my people need to learn that these battles aren't won with swords and shields and spears. These battles are won when God gives his people victory. All of the lessons that we really need to learn from the story of David and Goliath come from David's own mouth. A confidence that he had in God, an absolute unwillingness to let his God be defied and him not stand up on his behalf and for his honor, and to let this world know that there is a God in Israel, and to let my people know this is how God works. This is how God wins these battles. And this is what throws David to the forefront. David, thus far, has been a lowly shepherd. He has been a skilled player on the harp. And yet, when this battle is over, Saul realizes, I'm going to have a new son-in-law. I better find out a little bit more about this boy. Because it tells us here at the end of chapter 17, when Saul saw David go forth against the Philistine, he said unto Abner, the captain of the host, Abner, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, As thy soul liveth, O king, I cannot tell. And the king said, Well, inquire whose son the stripling is. And as David returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, Whose son art thou, thou young man? And David answered, I am the son of thy servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. And David now is thrown to the forefront, not just in the royal palace, not just in the king's court, not just to play before the king when he has a distressing spirit, but David is now viewed as a champion among the captain of the host, among the armies of Israel. He's put every single one of them to shame, and yet that was not his goal. His goal was to restore their confidence in God, that this is how God wins battles for his people, and to restore the name of God to all the nations that were around. When Goliath gave all the other nations reason to doubt that Israel had a God, David said, no, I will let them know that there is a God in Israel. And he took him down. It's a great story. We learn so much from it each time, right? Confidence in God, faith in God. David, just a great example of courage and faith. All right, let's be dismissed. Father, we're grateful to come